This video is going to continue to discuss the anatomy of type, and we're going to start with the spine. And the spine is the main curve of, say, the letter S. And the curve exists in the majority of the classifications. You won't really see it as much in, say, the decoratives and even some of the scripts. You'll see it, but not. It tends to be in a different way. And how you want to identify the spine is by the actual shape. Super simple to kind of think about. And what you want to do is you want to, not where it connects, and in a serif or sans serif typeface, a little bit more difficult to determine for the simple fact that it doesn't have that stress and stroke, which is sometimes the key identifier that we want to start and stop one of the anatomy pieces. But it's not difficult to recognize, so I'll just go ahead and use this typeface, which is our sans serif Helvetica typeface, and it's where it kind of makes the connection. So the spine is the connector piece, the shaped piece, the main curve of a given typeface. Lowercase, uppercase, S are the most common where you'll find a spine. The spur is a simple little area. Again, not in every typeface, so you do have to kind of think about it a little bit more. But the spur is actually anything that kind of comes off. A G is a good example, so that's why I gave a G. And I will do a G in our Baskerville to show that that one even has it, albeit very tiny. It also has a spur. And well, I'll go ahead and draw it for you on these particular typefaces. It's going to be different for all of them, so you have to kind of pay attention if you're looking for the spur, and to be able to identify where it is on a given typeface. And like I said, in this instance, it's super teeny tiny, but it's there. And you know, a part of the anatomy that you don't want to necessarily connect to anything else as a piece or anatomy piece. So it's just that little piece that sticks out is considered the spur. So anything that has like a little stick out, most likely it is protruding off of the typeface would be considered a spur. Stem. Kind of an easy one to consider. It's in a lot of our typefaces, so I'll use the word fall because it actually exists in all of these. But you're going to find the stem in a majority of our typefaces as well as our letters or our character forms. So not unusual, but where you have to be careful is you don't select the pieces that aren't necessarily a part of it. And you may find, how it's connected in description a little different throughout, but in reality, it's definitely a part of the up and down. So sometimes you'll find resources that say that the serif is a part of it, that it goes all the way to the top. Not all incorrect. So you just want to remember that the actual stem will be the up and down. Also, I'll redraw it just to show you that sometimes you're going to get resources that will tell you it is the up and down part of a given letter form. And we talked about the leg previously in the leg, how the leg is a part of a lot of the typefaces as well. So defining if it's the leg or the stem can be tricky sometimes. How I like to think about the stem is that the stem actually runs from the top of the letter form to the bottom of the letter form as the best way to kind of consider what a stem is versus what a leg is in the anatomy. Does it run to the top? Does it run to the bottom? And that would be classified as the stem. Again, you can see it in a lot of our typefaces, and all of our typefaces pretty much in a variety of the character forms themselves. The stress is not in every typeface. As you can see, the typeface I have selected here for the word stress doesn't really have a stress to it, but we can find stresses really easy in a lot of our serif typefaces, especially in our old style and traditional and modern typefaces. And the stress is easily to identify just by considering the angle of where the thicks and thins kind of start. So I'll go ahead and use a line to identify the stress. And what I like to tell people is you want to think about the stress as the area kind of where connections of the other anatomy are made, and it is consistent down the actual piece. So you're going to see where I'm kind of drawing the stress area, and it's not necessarily always precise, and it's not always necessarily, given the typeface, going to be as clean stressed down. The angle may be different. It may be very vertical. It may be very angular. It really definitely does depend, but there is the stress, and you can see those are consistently the same thickness, and that's what creates that stress, the same thickness in the letter form across the different areas, and that can identify the stress. The tail is not in every letter form, but it can be found in a lot of them and across a lot of our classifications. So I will go ahead and use the Baskerville R, but I could also utilize it in Garamond and show you that piece as well. I'm going to go ahead and draw that for you so you can see where I'm talking about. Again, with the tail, we have to be careful with where we select, but it's not terribly difficult to recognize the tail and where it kind of pulls off. A lot of times people say, well, that's the leg. Yeah, you're going to find a lot of crossover in communication of these particular pieces, but as I indicated with the leg and now with the tail, it really does depend on the actual typeface, whether it's a tail or a leg, and where you kind of identify the piece is important as well. Where you kind of cut it off is important as well. So the tail of the R, a tittle. A tittle is definitely not in every typeface, nor is it in every classification, but the tittle is actually the dot in an I and a j, lowercase j, and you will find that across a number of our typefaces. I'll just go ahead and select a different typeface. This is Gill Sans, a sans serif classification, just to show you that it is consistent. This J, that's I. The distance from the letter form, or in this case, the stem with the serif to the tittle is different than it is in some typefaces. In reality, all you ever have to look for is the circle shape, and if you get the circle shape down, you have identified that as the tittle, and the tittle can be differently shaped depending on the typeface. So just because it's not necessarily a circle, a circle, perfect circle, does not mean that it's not the tittle. So you want to be able to really just look for the piece that extends off the I or the J to identify it in that instance. The terminal, And the terminal is the piece that kind of falls off the end of more in the serif. So I'm going to switch back to the serif. I'll use a Baskerville. Typeface, easiest to identify, I think, is in the more the transitional or old styles. When you start getting into the moderns, you're going to find it a little more difficult to identify the terminal, but really, I like to say anything that kind of falls off the end of the F or a number of the type or letter forms is considered the terminal. And when working with that terminal, you just want to look for the shape that kind of ends. And we don't consider this a serif, and that is probably the most common mistake in identifying anatomy, is that a lot of times people want to consider this a serif. In reality, that's not a serif. The only serif the F has is down here with the bilateral serif at the foot. But that is considered the terminal as it falls off the F there at the top and has the little loop at the top. A good identifier is that loop. And I put the apex together with the vertex, and the reason is that some letter forms have an apex and a vertex, and it's not in every typeface and it's not in every letter form. And how I like people to kind of think about that, I'm going to go ahead and switch this to Garamond to I show you, because it has probably the most identified, and I'm going to use a capital M and I'm going to use a capital, or use a lowercase w. How's that? So in this instance, when it is above, or I'm sorry, below the baseline, I'll go ahead and draw in my baseline to show you. And when drawing my baseline, and we need to know what that baseline is in every typeface that we work on, because it helps us to identify kind of these pieces. I'll make that much thinner so that you can see, really identify the baseline more so in understanding. So anything in the baseline that is kind of hitting below, in this instance this M doesn't really have too much. Let's see if we choose something a little different. It's not in every typeface, so you can see that I'm kind of trying to identify where we may be able to find it more so. Nope. Let's do the W. So it has a little bit. So anything that kind of sits on or below is considered the vertex, and anything that kind of sits above the cap line or even the mean line is considered the apex. So you want to be able to identify that piece, those pieces that kind of sit just a little bit above or a little bit below, and my lines are a little too thick, so I'm going to drop them a little bit more just so you can see. And we just try to identify where the pieces are. You can see a little bit above, a little bit below, apex and vertex. A lot of times an A will also have it, a capital A has the vertex, and that's maybe a little easier for you to identify right there. And it's where we kind of put that cap line, and once we have that cap line identified, what kind of sits above that, and in this instance that would be considered the vertex. That little tiny piece that kind of sits above the cap line would be considered the vertex. So I'll go ahead and draw that to to make it a little easier to identify. As you noticed, it's not in every typeface, so I had to kind of search around for, and it's not in every letter form. And again, here's a perfect example of the vertex, that piece that kind of drops below the baseline. So this is the apex. Put that in. Is the piece above, and the vertex is the piece below the baseline, to help you give a little bit more of identity. I kept those two together because I wanted you to be able to identify above and below, and really be able to recognize the difference between those two anatomy pieces.